What sort of post-COVID, post-lockdown spirituality will you have? Stuart Murray, writing about the church in post-Christendom, talks about the relationship between believing and belonging. And it struck me as I read his book about post-Christendom that in the light of COVID and lockdown, etc., that what Murray says could well be dialed up to 10 in this post-COVID world we hopefully are heading into. So what kind of spirituality do you think you have heading towards the post-COVID era? So how has COVID affected your spirituality? How would you describe it? How would you describe what your spirituality is? During COVID, people have had a chance to think about what makes life meaningful. And for some, it's confronted them with the prospect of death and heightened the sense to connect with the Creator. But only for some. For many, losing the habit of church attendance has gone hand in hand with a change in how they perceive their faith, or indeed whether they have any faith at all. Belief, after all, follows behavior. And anyway, that Netflix show provides far more fodder for discussion and interaction than my local parish church does. And it's far more visually stimulating. And for some, this period of time has led to an increased realization and awakening. What is that awakening I'm talking about? It's perhaps something like this. Church didn't provide my life with the sense of community and meaning that I thought it did. In short, they discovered that absence didn't make the heart grow fonder, sometimes just cooler. And it's certainly not a case of simply putting it all down to laziness or a culture that bores easily. COVID, for many, will have dialed up to 10 some of the nagging uncertainties and doubts that were always there in the backs of their minds. The faith that once dominated their visual horizon feels different somehow, shrunken maybe, and just morphed into something different perhaps. And that which seems so meaningful to the faithful at the local congregation may no longer resonate. Murray and others write that in the Christendom era, we were required to believe and belong. What does that look like in the post-COVID era? Let's think about some of the ways we might describe our current situation in this COVID post-lockdown era. This is not to pass criticism on any particular position or state of being or wherever you fit on these categories, because we all have our journeys to undergo, but simply to provide some language and some frames of reference that might prove helpful, marker points on the journey, as it were. Firstly, daring to believe and belong. Maybe this describes you. There are those who continue to hold on to the faith they have always had, sometimes just with a quiet faithfulness, just genuinely caring people who like their faith as it has been since childhood. It's a rock in a turbulent, changing world. Other times, of course, that can be a kind of sanctified bloody-mindedness, or even can go hand in hand with a shrill refusal to budge an inch to accommodate quote-unquote worldliness or to engage with the culture. Daring to believe and belong. That's one option. Secondly, there is belonging but no longer believing. These are folks who gain a great deal of community from being part of a church. It provides social connection. It provides neighborliness and care. But of course the question is whether such community is sustainable without the belief system, or whether we are becoming disingenuous and keeping up a pretense of belief, thus not giving our true selves in community. The self that doubts, the self that questions. Thirdly, there is believing but no longer belonging. The stats of those who say they believe in a higher power are consistently high. This is in contrast to those who actually attend a faith community, of course. Maybe you've joined that section of society. Sometimes that means wanting the faith community to be there for weddings, high days, funerals, bar mitzvahs, whatever. As one wag put it, the Church of England is the ideal church for those who don't attend church. However, for you it may be a recent thing to no longer belong, and yet you still retain your beliefs. And typically you're the type of person this podcast is aimed for. So please keep tuning in. But maybe your journey means that post-lockdown you're moving from your local faith group into something you're not quite certain about. You still believe, but attendance is no longer the norm. You've left because church is not conducive to your discipleship journey. Then there is this one, belonging, but only partly believing. This is when you're hanging in there with the local worship center, but the narrative, the worldview they have just creates dissonance in you. It raises more questions. It doesn't ring true anymore. You have your doubts. You don't buy the whole kit, kabang and caboodle as you once did. You belong, but are not in lockstep with everyone else, or that's what it feels like. And perhaps COVID has made you reassess and question a whole number of things, maybe a theology of suffering and healing that has shifted you, or perhaps you're seeing church leadership through fresh eyes, having stepped away for lockdown. You still belong, but only partly believe. Number 5, believing but belonging less intensely. As a keen teenager, I was at church 4 times a week. There was 2 services on a Sunday, there was youth group after the evening service, and then there was a midweek meeting. We used to talk about those who are twicers, who came along twice on a Sunday. Now we talk about twicers in terms of those who come along twice a month or even twice a year. But perhaps for you, less intense belonging is actually not a problem. And maybe that's okay. Maybe it gets you out in the community, living like Jesus a little bit more, incarnating your discipleship. The question, of course, in this kind of category is what level of belonging is needed to sustain the Jesus lifestyle. We're not called to be solo workers operating by ourselves without community. Perhaps lockdown, though, has made you realize even more strongly that church is actually not the central hub in our communities anymore. Instead, being with others at the local club or at the local restaurant or at the local sports event, being with others different to you is more central to community life and is a key to healthy spiritual journeys. Hearing voices other than your own, or that echo chamber that the church can tend to be. That is believing but belonging less intensely. Then there is another category, believing and belonging intermittently. And some of these overlap just a little bit, but there's enough nuance of difference to make them distinct categories. This one might mean a period away from a faith community, eventually returning at a future date, but possibly even to a different community. Or it might mean having something we call our home church, but we frequently attend other places of worship. And to use current parlance, we network our spirituality, which truly sounds awful to me, but okay. Peter Ward writes about this and he calls this liquid church. Now, sometimes that's just consumerism, but it can also give fresh perspectives on the limitations of the worldview that we are familiar with. Perhaps tuning into someone else's church service during lockdown has expanded your theological horizons. And this perhaps is no bad thing. No local church community can fully represent the whole church. But then again, it can be an excuse for church surfing, or even just an avoidance of questions and doubts about the faith that are unresolved. That's believing and belonging intermittently. Belonging, but not yet believing. This is a smaller category generally, but you might be in the category of someone for whom COVID has caused you to re-examine life's questions, the big ones. God, the world and everything. And you may even have started attending a faith community. Well, I want to encourage you, keep walking, keep observing, keep examining, for example, the life of Jesus. This community you are connected to is a flawed one, no doubt, but perhaps trying to live in the light of the divine one. Belonging may take time. Believing may take even longer. That's okay. Hang in there and find those who are able to cope with your questions and your doubts. We're getting there. There are 9 of these. Here's number 8. Believing, but not yet belonging. Again, maybe just a few people out there who have connected with the message of faith, but not yet connected to others. We were never meant to do this journey in isolation, so I encourage you to connect to a community that allows you to question and to doubt, but also encourages you to be connected in such a way that you're stimulated, that you're challenged, that you're directed in your walk. And finally this one, neither belonging nor believing. Stephen Green writes this: conventional wisdom and common sense suggest that people stopped going to church because they no longer believed what the churches taught them. Perhaps, in fact, the causal mechanism was really closer to the opposite of this. They stopped believing because they stopped going. If you see yourself in this category, I'm sure you will have asked questions about why you stopped attending or why you stopped believing. It's always worth reflecting on the interplay between those two. So there's our categories. Perhaps you can think of some more categories or ways in which they overlap a little. There is some narrow lines of distinction between each of these categories, of course. We live in the post-Christendom era. The church is no longer the center of community life, and more often not often the center of spiritual life. And many in the Western world are voting with their feet. We're moving towards the post-COVID era, we hope and pray. A period of time which has caused some to reassess both their belief system and which community of faith or none that they belong to. Which of those terms best describes you? Perhaps on a Tuesday you're one thing and then on a Wednesday you feel like you're in another category. Wherever you are and whatever your relationship to the spiritual journey, keep walking. My name is Jools. This is thechurch.com. Thanks for listening.